Hi, I'm Simcha Raphael. I am the author of Jewish Views of the Afterlife. And in the real world, I work as a death awareness educator, a transpersonal psychotherapist, and have spent many hours as a college professor and freelance lecturer.
I know this is starting us off on a tangent, but then you said transpersonal psychologist? What is that?
Transpersonal psychology is a spiritually oriented approach to psychotherapy, so that we're not only looking at the realm of human pathology and the personality, but also the higher dimensions, the spiritual dimensions, the artistic, the creative, the, quote, transpersonal, beyond the personal dimensions. So that goes back to having trained in California in the late 70s and 1980s, which brings me around to the topic we're going to be talking about. In the mid-1980s, I wrote my doctoral dissertation on life after death in Judaism, with applications for working with dying and bereaved. And only in California in the late 70s, 1980s, could you write a dissertation in a psychology PhD program on afterlife. In 1994, my reworked doctoral dissertation came out as Jewish Views of the Afterlife. In 2009, Jewish Views of the Afterlife was published in a second edition, and I'm proud to say that in 2019, Jewish Views of the Afterlife was published in a third 25th anniversary edition.
Were there any heavy changes from first to second and second to third in the anniversary edition?
Well, I wrote about the what, like what does Judaism have to say about life after death? And in the second edition, I wrote about the so what. So what do we do about that? How did that change the way we think about Jewish death rituals of burial, funeral, Shiva Kaddish, Yizkor Yortzeit, technical terms, but basically the Jewish traditions around death and mourning. And over the years, the one question that people often would ask me was about reincarnation. In the first and second edition, I had some material on reincarnation, and for the third edition, I quadrupled that amount of material. I did a lot more research, and I also have a new chapter in there called Spirits, Ghosts, and Dibbuks in Yiddish Literature. And to do simultaneous translation, Dibbuks are sort of malevolent, possessing spirits.
I'm curious because, I was going to hit reincarnation later, but because, I added things in these latest editions about this, because people asked, I'm curious, what was the audience of people who were asking about Jewish views on reincarnation? Were they everyday Jews you would encounter, or are there people more comparative religion, wide open thinking people who'd come to a seminar of yours? Who was asking?
Yes to both.
Okay.
Yes to both. I don't want to jump too far ahead of myself.
Okay. Well, then we won't jump. I'll go all the way back to the beginning, which is, I am a convert, and I remember this from 21, 22 years from whenever I converted. The touching on the afterlife, it was discussed. The Jews sort of say this about a Messiah coming at some point. Here's the criteria for the Messiah. And then here's what some things traditionally say about what might happen to the human bodies or the souls. But about exactly what happens between now and then, it's not the concern. Judaism is about the world here, not the world to come, the Olam Haba. And so I'm wondering, where do you think either Judaism or Jews today, or the tradition, or people outside Judaism, where do we get the whole idea that Jews and proper Judaism isn't that interested in the afterlife?
Okay, well, you've successfully drank the Kool-Aid.
Okay.
So let me backtrack a little.
Okay.
When I was in my early 20s, my closest friend was killed in a car accident. And I had been with him on a Saturday night. Actually, he helped me cook a meal. I was one of those sort of progressive guys who would cook for my date on a Saturday night. And my friend was from an Orthodox Jewish family, so we said our goodbyes, and he would go see his father every Motzei Shabbat at the end of the Sabbath. And the meal turned out all right. The date turned out all right. And in Montreal, we can go out for coffee late at night on the streets of Montreal at 2 o'clock in the morning. That, it's a very much of a late night city. And I walked out of a cafe or a club, and there was a full moon. And I said to her, there's something very auspicious about that full moon. I don't know what it is, but there's something very auspicious about that full moon. Took her home, went to sleep, and at 5 a.m, I got a call from another friend of mine saying the friend I had been with earlier that evening had just been killed in a car accident. And if somebody would have said to me, Simcha, you're going to spend many years of your life talking to people about death and life after death, I would have said, that's somebody else's story. That's not my story. But very early on, I felt a sense of his presence. He was buried in a place called Mount Pleasant Memorial Park. I promise you there was absolutely nothing pleasant about burying a 22-year-old kid in the dead of a Montreal winter. But even in the cemetery, I felt a sense of his presence. During the week that we were sitting Shiva, which is a 7-day mourning, a ritual mourning in Jewish tradition, it was almost as if a few of us said, didn't you feel like Leslie was present in the room? During that first year, he appeared to me in a dream. So there were a number of meaningful coincidences or felt sense of presence that I experienced. And when I began to look at what Judaism had to say about life after death, there was somewhere between very little and almost nothing.
Okay. Yeah, that's been my experience. Yeah.
Right? And it's not that I wasn't Jewishly educated. I already had an honors degree in religion and Jewish studies. I had done Hebrew day school in my early years. And so I knew enough where to look, but I couldn't find very much. And it took a little while, and I eventually met the man who was to become my teacher, Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, who for many years was sort of seen as the father of Jewish renewal and really bridged traditional Jewish mystical studies and contemporary society, contemporary life. And he said, afterlife, you want to go, you want to read about afterlife, you have to go here, here, and here. And he sent me basically into the text of the pre-modern Jewish community. And that was around the time I was beginning graduate school, and at some point he said, hey, how about if I'll be on your committee and you'll write on death and afterlife in Judaism? And so what I did was I spent somewhere between 7 and 10 years reading everything I can get my hands on death and afterlife. I had written on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. I had written on death and reincarnation in Theosophy. And so essentially what my book tried to show was the notion that Judaism doesn't have a belief in afterlife is really a modern misrepresentation. But if you go into the early text, you go into the teachings of the Kabbalists, of the Hasidic masters, you go into Yiddish folk literature, the Fiddler on the Roof story is an afterlife story. And those traditions were weeded out, in a sense, by the Enlightenment, rationalism, scientific materialism. As I like to say, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, remember that famous psychologist Simcha Freud, right? After Simcha Freud says religion is a universal obsessional neuroses, and standing in front of dead bodies, human beings created spirits and afterlife. So that was sort of the MO, the modus operandi for Jewish life in the 20s and the 30s, and right through World War II of the last century. And then slowly a kind of reclaiming of Jewish mysticism, both through academic and through personal practice, and Reb Zalman was a very important part of that. 70s, the 80s, material started coming back into the culture. And in a sense, the work that I have done over many years has been what I'm calling these days spiritual archaeology, reclaiming the lost tradition that Jews do have a belief in life after death.
Can I? This is mirrored. So this is a very American-centric view, but Christianity in America and maybe all over the world, and certainly nestled inside some of the smartest theology of the great thinkers of Christianity, have involved heaven and hell and spirits and the afterlife. Seems like a core thing, and it can be dismissed by more liberal branches, but it's a core thing in the theology. Do you have any being an archaeologist, kind of jumping over the modern world back to where these things were, do you know why these things, what the flourishing or the thriving of modern Judaism was that wanted to weed out stuff and consider it superstition instead of, no, we need to bake this into our theology and really wrestle with it?
It's really the Enlightenment. In Judaism, it's called the Haskalah. It's sort of the German Judaism, the German Jewish intellectual spirit, or Weltanschauung, sort of the world view, beginning in the 1820s, 1830s, really wants to rewrite Judaism as a religion of reason.
Okay. So
these non-rational ideas are reframed or weeded out. Now, I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
I often teach about Jacob's deathbed. In the book of Genesis, Jacob is about to die. He gathers his kids around. He chews some of them out, and he gives them his burial instructions. Bury me in the cave in the field, and they were back in Canaan land. And Jacob was gathered to his ancestors. That's how his death story ends. He slept with his ancestors, I think is the exact metaphor. And so, at a mythic level, it's returning to the realm of the ancestors. One could interpret that as it was seen in the ancient Near Eastern world of the time, that one returns to a realm of disembodied deceased beings. To show you that I went to Hebrew school, a living being was called nefesh chaya, like a living spirit, and a dead being was nefesh met, a dead spirit. So while you were alive, you hung out in the family clan. Remember, the ancient Jews, they were Bedouins. They sort of had the husband, the wife, the kids, the goats, the camels as a collective community. So while you were alive, you hung out there, and when you were dead, you hung out with the ancestors. So the German Jewish philosophers rewrite that to say that when he says it, he joined his ancestors, that meant that you live on through your descendants, which is a total rewriting of it. That's not in the text. So that it was really the 1800s, scientific thinking, philosophical rationalism, and also there's two other reasons why we lost it. After the Holocaust, nobody wants to talk about 6 million dead souls. The imperative for Jewish life after World War II was to settle refugees, to guarantee the existence of the State of Israel, to make sure that Jewry was safe in different communities all around the world. Nobody wanted to talk about the Holocaust for a whole generation. So that also created a gap between traditional thought and 20th century thought. The other thing, with all due respect, is that there was this attitude sort of, well, Christians believe in that stuff and we don't.
Yes. Oh, so it's it's another one of many differentiators.
They believe this stuff. Right. But that doesn't mean that Judaism doesn't have a belief in life after death. I mean, I wrote a 475-page book. There's a, I looked at images of post-mortem survival in biblical, apocryphal, rabbinic, medieval philosophy, medieval legend, Kabbalah, and Hasidism. The other thing, and you mentioned that at the very beginning when you talked about sort of the interpretation of Jewish ideas about life after death that you were exposed to, there's a whole tradition about at the time of the Messiah, the Jews will be resurrected.
Yes.
St. Paul goes, when you die, you're automatically resurrected in Christ. Traditional Judaism goes, well, you sort of have to hang out until when the Messiah comes, everyone will come back. That is, but that, and as you rightfully said, that doesn't explain what happens to Joe and Jane Jew from now until then. So
right.
there are, to be somewhat academic, there are two strands. There is what we call individual eschatology. Eschatology is one of those words that scholars throw around like a basketball. Eschatos is about end of time, so it's the study of end of times. So there's individual eschatology, what will happen to the individual person after death, and there's collective eschatology, what will happen to the Israelite nation after death. And in Judaism, certainly based on how it was in the Bible, which is to understand what will happen to the nation that goes into exile and comes back out of exile, and when you're in God's graces, you're okay, you go into the land, and when you're not, God's pissed off at you, and you get sent off to the principal, or right. So the Judaism often emphasized collective eschatology, the fate of the nation, and resurrection over individual eschatology, the fate of the individual after death. And for me, it was a combination of reading the Tibetan Book of the Dead, reading near-death experiences, studying theosophy, and Elizabeth Kubler-Ross psychology, that I sort of mixed all that together in a blender with Kabbalistic philosophy and Hasidic tales, and came up with a clearer understanding of what traditional pre-modern Judaism had to say about life after death.
You kicked off, and I really liked it, you kicked off a bit with kind of your own origin story of how you fell into this lifelong, decades-long work. And it's a very personal encounter with death and the afterlife. So that feeling, that deep down in your bones or deep in your brain or deep in your soul, that you were encountering a presence that is still here, even though a person has moved on. This person is dead. For those who stand outside that, like myself, and read about these things, but have not themselves encountered what they feel like would be something that is inexplicable in the material world, where are those people left? I feel like a lot of people who come seeking this are, I've had a weird experience, I can't explain, I want to know more about it. But then there's the rest of us who are like, I didn't have a weird experience, think it's very interesting, and I want to know more about it, but I didn't have the experience, so where am I?
Well, what I often say is that between this world and the world beyond is a window and not a wall. Okay. Between the world of the living and the world of the dead is a window and not a wall. And scientific materialism says it's a wall. Dead is dead, you're out of here, that's it. But traditional cultures all around the world have had this sense that there's some way in which the word these days has become the ancestors. There's a lot of stuff about our ancestors. That there's some connection between those of us who are still alive and the realm of the ancestors. And so what I will say to people is, I'm not selling belief. There's usually some guy sitting in the front row of my talks with his arms folded, with a big fat ring. You can smell the cigar on him. Most of these people have died off by now, but that was right. That was sort of the stereotypical imagery. And he sort of says, "I don't believe in any of that afterlife crap. Now let's talk." And to those people, I say, I'm not selling belief, because if I say believe and you say I don't believe, then we're in an adversarial relationship. I will sell you my books. You go to daatinstitute.net, D-A-A-T institute.net, and under bookstore you will find my books there. So to those people, I say at least understand what Judaism has to say, and ultimately we all have to do our own meaning making around the reality of human mortality. The reality is, ain't none of us getting out of here alive. Not today, relax, right? My Auntie Rose of blessed memory would say, everyone has their expiry date tattooed on their body. She would say, mine's on my ass, I can't see it, and I don't worry about it. To which I said to her, Auntie Rose, it's a good thing, because if you could see your ass from behind, you would probably drop dead. Right? So given the reality that all of us are going to die, and as one ages, we find that more and more of our contemporaries are dying. There's a certain, I have a lot of clients who are sort of like just past midlife crisis, so they're in their 50s or 60s, and they're in that stage of life where they're dealing with their parents' sickness, aging, and dying. I mean, that seems to happen. So given the reality that people do die, if we're going to be in any way aware and thoughtful, we need to make our own meaning making around the reality of human mortality. So for me, the notion that I could still feel some sense of presence with beings who have died and have had a variety of experiences, and everybody needs a good psychic once in a while too, that helps me in my own meaning making. But I can't do the meaning making for you or for anybody listening to this podcast. I think everybody has to figure that one out on their own.
I can imagine your old gentleman with the fat ring and the big fingers, arms crossed, with the smell of cigar smoke on him, is also in his nicer moments could be like, well, I understand why you want to believe. It's wishful thinking.
Exactly.
Because it's painful to consider your own mortal finitude, that you won't go on. And also these people you love, they're not there anymore. It's a terrible sense. How can they just be completely gone? But then the person who doesn't believe would say, I understand you need it. It's wishful thinking on your part.
Absolutely. I mean, I encounter that all the time. And what I want to say is secular skepticism is a legitimate point of view within the realm of Jewish thought. The way I'm framing my lectures these days is, do Jews believe in life after death? The answer to that question is some do and some don't.
Yeah.
Does Judaism believe in life after death? In the pre-modern world, there's never any question about it. They don't sit around and say, you'll forgive my Yiddish accent and my stereotype, well, Moshe, do you think about afterlife? And, Chaim, I'm not so sure. It was hardwired into the culture. There are so many ritual activities that we have around death traditions that emphasize or that point to a belief in some post-mortem consciousness.
Is there, and I watched a long presentation you had on YouTube, teaching a class on YouTube, watched the whole thing, which is part of the reason I reached out. So I read part of the book, saw that presentation, said I have to talk to you. I remember an episode that Penn and Teller did years ago on their TV show, and what they would do is they would kind of approach things skeptically and try to dig into. One of the things in psychics saying they can talk to people who've passed on is the worry, and I think it's a worry to take note of, is there is a danger in believing that there are people out there, and that people out there can make money off of taking advantage of the fact that you don't want your aunt to be completely gone, and that I can talk to your aunt. So I want to ask, in general in Judaism, do you see any danger zones where things reach from kind of healthy study and healthy experience of the afterlife into manipulation and kind of superstition that gets capitalized on and weaponized and people take advantage of?
Well, maybe it's because I was schooled in California,
Gives you a certain
and
perspective.
because I have some good stories about that, and because I sort of think of myself as having a good nose for these things, and I've had some positive, very clear experiences with psychics that I certainly haven't had a sense of somebody taking advantage of me, because if I felt they weren't that good, I wouldn't go back to them the second time.
Right.
Right. But there's some uncanny stories sometimes. Yeah, I'm trying to think of which ones I want to point to. Well, my mother, after my father died, went to see a psychic or spoke with her. And my father died of a massive heart attack like that. So she said, you left so quickly without even saying goodbye. And he said, well, it's kind of quick for me also. And through the psychic, my father said to my mother, get the picture of me with my father and keep it near you and I'll always be with you. Now, my father was born in 1916. There was no Brownie camera. There was no digital photography. They had to go into a studio. And and my mother knew exactly what he was talking about. We have an old sepia photograph where my father must have been 6 or 7 or 8 years old. That was done in studio with he and my grandfather, his father. So this woman's name was Margaret. Margaret, would just pick that up,
Yeah.
very, very clearly, and sometimes people have a sense of somebody how did you know all this information? But I you know what? I don't want to go too far afield with psychics. I'll tell you why. Because I think what I said earlier was I wrote the first book on the what. What does Judaism have to say? And then I added the chapter called Afterlife and the Renewal of Jewish Death Rituals, the so what. And I think, how does a sense of a belief in an afterlife help us in dealing with the rituals that we practice? So Shiva, for example, 7 days of collective mourning. Oh, that was a great Shiva. Who catered that Shiva? That was really good food in that Shiva, right? So sometimes we get lost in the outer dimension of the food and the meaningless banter and that. But more and more people will say, we're gonna pause for a few minutes at the end of the Amidah, at the end of the silence prayer, and see if anybody wants to say anything or feel any sense of what they're hearing from their loved ones. So we bring into the conversation the notion that between this world and the world beyond is a window and not a wall. At the end of the Shiva, it's traditional to walk around the block. Why do you walk around the block? Because if you don't start walking, you're really going to need a bad diet. You're really going to have to do a diet and exercise all over. But as I learned from my teacher, it's also as if we're saying to the deceased, we're going to walk you this far and now you have to go the rest of the way on your own. So when my wife was sitting Shiva for her father before we walked her around the block, she said, it said in a Torah that Jacob was gathered to his ancestors. So who are the ancestors to whom my father has been gathered? And so we went around the room, and my father-in-law's first cousin was there, and he mentioned their mutual grandmother and some of our friends. So it brought a quality of meaning making into the ritual. And I think that's really what I've been trying to do, is help people with their own meaning making around dying and death. If you want to see a psychic, call me. I got lots of suggestions, but it's helping people make sense of sometimes the tragedy of death, and it's also validating when people have those kind of experiences that I did in my 20s of feeling a sense of presence. Because people might have those kind of experiences. People say, oh, I just had a dream about my father, my mother, and I'll say, there's lots of material in our Jewish sources that say the dead speak to us in dreams. Right? People will say, I felt a sense of their presence. And I want to say, we have a strong sense, and there are anecdotal stories and there are textual stories that those beings on the other side can actually visit us in these realms. So it's really about validating people's experience that often they're reluctant to share.
You mentioned the word tragedy, and again, you started off with this example of, again, one major tragedy that we all recognize: young people taken too soon. It's one thing for your 98-year-old grandmother to pass on after a wonderful life, and she's declining, and a young person just so unexpectedly. Do you think it takes in meaning making if you think the wall comes down and the person, as the materialist would say, they're just dead. That's it. That life, whatever the promise was, all that is just gone. That person's gone completely, except whatever memories you have, whatever the atoms are, that's it. Does it help people come to terms with tragic deaths more? Have you seen that, where people are able to massage their internal parts and make themselves feel better when someone goes and it's unexpected, or it's a terrible thing that happened to them, or it seems unfair?
I was at was in my doctor's office. I went to have a blood draw at one of those locations, and the woman had a dog tag. And I said, "That's interesting. What's that?" She said, "It's my son. He was murdered 4 years ago or whatever." And I don't remember exactly what I said, but because I'm sensitive to bereavement, I didn't make her grief invisible. I acknowledged it. And she said, he's with me all the time. And so sometimes people need to have that sense of feeling, even though they've disappeared, there's some moment of connection. I have somebody else who talks about winks, they get winks from the other side. So what I've done with my writing and with my counseling is sort of saying to people, death is not always the end of the story, but there are ways in which, through our rituals, through certain kind of prayers, through a psychic, through dreams, we can feel that sense of connection. So let me give you another story.
Yeah.
The earlier version of the story for me personally was when I was 4 years old. My grandmother died, and she was really close. I was really close with her. In some ways, she raised me more than my mother in those early years of my life. And as they would have done in 1955, they told me Bubby went to heaven.
Okay.
So I was a dreamy little kid, so I spent the next 4, 5, 8 years talking to her in heaven. I remember lying in my bed at night, praying to God. I don't know where I got that notion, and feeling the sense of my grandmother's presence. And so it became inculated in me that there was still some sense of continuity after death. And I don't, the rationalists and the skeptics go, well, you were just a lonely kid, you made that up. But I don't know, it just felt very, very real to me. And subsequent experiences were along those lines.
You've talked about the length at which you've gone to deep scholarly study and the personal experiences you've had. I also noticed, maybe this will be the first book I read. I noticed you wrote a book of poetry. Would you tell me what the genesis of that book of poetry was and what you wrote about?
I actually have two books of poetry.
Two? Okay.
Seeing that we're doing non-paid, non-political announcements.
Yeah.
First one is called Echoes from the Ashes. I went on something called the March of the Living, which they take high school kids for a week in Poland and a week in Israel, and I was one of 10 staff with a group of 50 kids that we did a romp through the concentration camps. And so that book is a collection of poetry and photography that I did during the March of the Living. Which has a story about Dybbuk possession in there. But that's another... you can bring back to that in a minute. Musings with the Angel of Death.
That's what caught my...
Poems of Love, Life, and Longing. It's just published... Okay, you have to edit out my... clearing my throat here on this one, but if not, welcome to life on a podcast.
Exactly.
So, the genesis of... So I've been writing poetry on and off a lot of my life. But the genesis of that particular title goes like this. For, at least 20 years or more, I would do these professional development workshops on bereavement counseling skills. I was an adjunct professor in the religion department of LaSalle University, which is a Catholic university. And for a while I was a Jewish chaplain, so I was wearing my yarmulke all the time then. And when I was teaching, I would teach with the yarmulke on. And here I was teaching nuns and priests bereavement counseling, which goes to show God has a sense of humor. But when I would do these workshops... And I'm doing one, incidentally, in a few weeks on afterlife and the journey of soul and Kabbalah and Tibetan Buddhism, so I'm still doing that. I would do a meditation where, imagine yourself walking in a peaceful place. Up ahead, there's your image of death. What does your image of death look like? What does death have to say to you? What do you have to say to death? And, it was a good humanistic psychology exercise.
Yeah.
My classes were often 12 to 15 to 18 people. And I would do what they called an academic retreat. So I'd get 5 days working with the same group of people. So I had enough time to process people's experiences. So I heard, I don't know if I want to say hundreds, but maybe, of different stories of people having a conversation with death.
Describing the result of this meditation.
Right. And basically what death says is, I'm here, and then someone says, well, I'm not interested, I got things going on. And death says, you can have all that you want going on, but I'm still here. Just remember that. So if you're not ready now, I'm okay with that, but I'm coming back for you. The other thing that would happen, it was very interesting, death would change often. I mean, not everybody's experience is identical, but this is sort of the structure, the paradigm, would change from a scary, dark being, like the Grim Reaper, to more of an angel or a being of light. And I think that represents how we're changing as a culture from seeing death as the Grim Reaper to death as a being of light. So I wrote out my own conversation with the angel of death. I wrote out, hey, look at all I've done, like I've had all this. Death goes, yeah, so? Yeah, but come on. I mean, I've written books on death. It's like,
present your CV to death. Okay.
yeah, right. Exactly. Exactly. So that's one of the poems. But also during the years that I was mourning my father and my mother separately, my mother and father both died on December 29th, 9 years apart.
Wow.
So they both died on the same date, which is the same date a cousin of mine had been killed also in a traffic accident. And so there were some of those poems, and then other things I had written about. I think one of the themes that comes through in this book of poetry is the importance of appreciating this life, because it could be very ephemeral. I remember we were on a family vacation in New Jersey, which sounds like an oxymoron, family vacation in New Jersey, but we had like a Labor Day weekend, I think it was, on the beach, and my wife and my 2 children were building castles in the sand. And so I wrote a poem about, there they are building the castles in the sand, and how long are these castles going to last? An hour, 4 hours, until the changing of the tides washes it away. But in the meantime, maybe one day my wife and I will be too old to come to the shore. So for now, just appreciate this very moment as it is.
Okay, so that's interesting, because I think that brings me all the way back to the beginning when I was kind of talking about, we have a vision for Christianity, and I'm always a bit puzzled in the way some Christians talk about heaven and hell and the afterlife. If you think you're going to go to heaven, heaven is this wonderful place where everything bad will be gone and everything good will be there, and you will be in God's radiance and you'll be close to God. It's going to be wonderful. So when someone dies here, theologically, there are some people who believe, at least they intellectually believe, this person has gone on to a better place. So it seems to me this sense of loss, that should lessen the sense of loss. The person has gone off to a better place. And Judaism has always seemed to me nestled more, if not maybe in one bad version, disregarding the afterlife and saying, don't be concerned about the world to come, only be concerned about the now. But that does lead you to appreciate and be grateful for the finite life you have, if you don't see everything as, well, it's just a timeline. I'm here for a while, and then my soul's out, and it'll be off someplace better. Who cares?
Right. Well, it's really a juxtaposition of both the eternality of it and the temporality of it all. I'm not going to get this exactly right, but there's one rabbi who said, like, this world is only a corridor to the world to come. But at the same time, this world is the realm in which one can perform the mitzvot and live fully. So it's both. It really is both. There was never a sense in Judaism of a primacy of the world beyond over this life. They both are in a kind of active tension with each other. And so when you look at what Jews have done in the world, the number of Jews, well out of proportion, Jews who have won Nobel Prizes, the fact that this little politics notwithstanding, the Israeli government being problematic, what this country has done, just to, if all the anti-Semites in the world knew that ways and some of these are all produced by the Israelis, they wouldn't be surprised, So there is a sense of affirming this world. I'm actually going to find my copy. I want to read you a poem.
Oh, awesome.
Under a Fragile Thatched Roof. Okay, so this needs a little bit of background. During the fall season, Jews built something called a sukkah. It's often translated as a tabernacle. It's a temporary structure that would have been built in the fields in ancient Israel during the time of the harvest. And growing up in Montreal in the 60s, the synagogues had them, school had them, but by October it was too bloody cold already to spend much time in the sukkah. But with the environmental movement and with more of a do-it-yourself kind of practice in some and many Jewish communities, not just in the Orthodox communities, but in the liberal progressive communities, people will build all these beautiful sukkot. That's the plural of sukkah. So this is called Under a Fragile Thatched Roof. Under a fragile thatched roof, full-breasted mother moon and a subtle glitter band of twinkling stars transparently peek through from the heavenly spheres to this temporary transient human realm. Naked, undefended against the elements, I sit in silent contemplation in this sukkah of peace. Unprotected and vulnerable in the face of life's ever-changing transitions, knowing one turn of the cosmic clock, one subtle stopped heartbeat, an unanticipated wind of change, death, divorce, destruction, hurricane, shadowy eruptions of hell, fire, flood, fatality, or fanaticism, or any of a million other maybes can wipe away this moment, this life, this most fragile sukkah, this life story I call my own, and bring in its wake who knows what, where, why, or why not. And all I can do is live with the unfolding of the blessing and the curse, and choose life as well as I am able to. So in this temporary sukkah of peace, I am reminded to harvest in holy humility, a sacred sense of how good it is to be alive, how good it is for sisters and brothers to sit, sing, and pray together as one. So I think it goes back to my friend's death. You know, there we were hanging out, schmoozing, and then he was dead. And it's not a morbid sense that I feel after many years later, but it's a sense of like a realism around the finite nature of life. I've had a lot of experience of people just here one day and gone the next. In my family, there were more heart attacks and traffic accidents than slow lingering cancer. But the world being what it is, the human body being what it is, it can all be ripped away from us. So, what the hell? Let's sing and dance and celebrate. Let's make a l'chaim to life. Let's read about life after death. Let's have a lot of parties, because that's sort of what we don't want to sit around in despair. Enjoy the ride.
Okay, now you except for the tack on, now you sound very Kohelet-like.
Oh, well, Kohelet happens to be, Kohelet is Ecclesiastes. That's one of my favorite books.
Do you find in experiencing so many different people at their crisis points, or before their crisis points when they're just curious about things, or after their crisis points when they spent time processing and thinking these things through and they have their philosophies about how these things operate too, do people, that poem kind of encapsulates, it feels beautiful, but as you identified, well, you can go one way and be horrified and fearful that you are in a temporary structure completely open and that you could die and this could all fall apart and all your plans could deteriorate at any moment. That's just awful, I think, for most people at most times of their life. I think it's beautiful, but did you find that people are open to thinking about that, or have you experienced a lot of, as you talk about kind of counseling people through death, resistance to that feeling that this is what life is like and that it's so precious and fragile?
Well, you don't know. That's why I don't like that phrase. In my teaching, I use a lot of humor. My work has been to bring people closer to the reality of dying and death without being so fear-filled. And so some people don't want to hear from it.
Right.
But when I tell the story of my aunt saying everybody has their hour of death, and I say, Auntie Rose, if they saw your ass from behind you drop dead, people laugh. So when you laugh, you can't hold the tightness around. So I use a lot of humor in my teachings. And like if I'm in a room full of, a lot of my teaching is in, I do scholar in residence weekends in synagogues and do one-shot gigs in synagogues. And through the years, a lot of them are sort of midlife and older.
Yeah.
And I'll say, have you signed a living will? And some people say no. I say, what are you waiting for? You live too long to die young. So I have a few lines, like Simcha Freud. I have a few of those that work, and so I've used a lot of humor in my work to lower the barrier of fear in confronting the inevitability of our mortality, and encouraging people to cultivate their own sense of spirit. And I wrote something recently about the Torah portion that's coming up in 2 weeks, is about the building of the Mishkan, the building of the tabernacle.
Okay.
And there's a line in Torah that says, God says, Tasuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham. Build for me a holy tabernacle, and I will dwell within. Today, we build that holy tabernacle within us. Herod had an edifice complex, and Herod isn't around anymore to do any of that construction for us. So, and we don't have the temple in Jerusalem. That's another whole set of problems there. So when we build the temple within, we can house spirit. And I think ultimately that's what I'm trying to do with all of this, is that if we cultivate a sense of connection with spirit in our lives, we will be maybe more prepared or less fearful in the face of death. Heaven in Judaism, Gan Eden, is not guaranteed in the same way, like everybody just goes to the same place of all of the angels, all that. The clouds in heaven. That's because they let you smoke at the bar, by the way. In Judaism, heaven is based upon our accrual of merit and deeds. So there's said to be 7 realms of heaven. So are you going to get a Motel 6? Are you going to get a Best Western? You're going to get a Hilton? You're going to get an apartment in French Riviera? Right? So heaven is based upon the quality of the life that we have lived. And similarly, there's Gehenna, which is purgation, where we have to sort of clean up the unresolved karmic residue, to schlep a word from another culture, of our life, but it's not permanent. Traditionally there's not eternal damnation in Judaism. Everybody dies with a certain amount of incomplete stuff. You have to spend a little bit of time processing that, and then you go to Miami Beach.
Was there ever Rabbi Shachter Shalomi explored and was open to, took Judaism to other cultures and other religions as well and pulled stuff back. Was there ever another culture or another religion that so spoke to you that you're like, maybe I want to do Jew a little less and I want to do this one a little more?
Well, two things on that. There's a book called Jews, God, and History, where Max Diamond, I know it's over 50, 60 years ago he wrote that, talks about the interaction between cultures throughout history. So in ancient Samaria and Babylonian culture, there's some exchange between Judaism and the surrounding world, and under Persian culture and the Greek culture. So Judaism has been a millennia-long semi-permeable membrane.
Okay. Yeah.
We're very good at absorbing elements from other cultures. That being said, as yet unwritten, I want to title my memoir "From the Fringe to the Frontier, a Serendipitous Spiritual Odyssey," because what was fringe in my early 20s, yoga, meditation, that is become normative. Now you can go to every Y and you'll get in, right? Or they're doing mindfulness meditation in the synagogues. They're doing, and in the churches, and then so having a degree in history and philosophy of religion, where we're doing Hinduism and Buddhism and religious history of Western civilization and introduction to the New Testament, right? And then I was at the California Institute of Integral Studies, which is integration of East and West, where the Tibetan Buddhism, and I had a research grant to study theosophy, which is sort of Madame Blavatsky and spiritualism, and that as a model for psychotherapy. I met Starhawk, now I'm name dropping, at a spiral dance Halloween ritual that she did in 1979 when she launched her book called The Spiral Dance, and I went and followed up with her and met personally, and she taught me everything a rabbi in training needed to know about the goddess. So I've been a long-term dabbler in all of this stuff, but because of my connection with Reb Zalman, I feel like I've stayed. My roots have been within Judaism and Jewish spiritual practice, and my wife and I proposed to her when we were lighting Shabbat candles, and I said we will always have a home where we light Shabbat candles, and we have. And if we go out for a restaurant, I'll do my Shabbat blessings in the restaurant.
So I guess this is my last question, and I'm wondering, that was kind of asking about your thinking about other philosophies and other traditions. In your faith and your connection with God, how much, if you looked at the life pie of all of this is what constitutes my faith, how much of it is thinking about the afterlife and what happened before you were here and what happens after you're here? Is it a huge part that you think about all the time? I understand it's your study, but is it a big part of your connection to God and Judaism?
I had to take my son to the dentist today. I had to call the cleaning lady and change the day she was coming to from Friday to Sunday, because I have somebody coming on Friday to help me put away the snow blower and the shovels and the firewood and take out the lawn furniture. So I live in 3D reality most of the time, and especially. Now my children are young adults. I have a 26-year-old and a 35-year-old. Though I was 47 when we had my daughter, so I could go from the Pampers aisle to the Depends aisle very easily. So the answer is, On one hand, I live very much in what they call tachlis. Tachlis is sort of brass tacks, like community reality. On the other hand, I'm 73 years old and I'm thinking a lot of legacy. So I've also arranged to pay for my burial in Knoxville, Tennessee, and I have an appointment to go over my will with a lawyer friend of mine, and I am a ferocious collector of ritual objects and books, and I tried to get a King Tut clause where they just seal off the doors and the windows and they bury me in here with all the crap, but they refused me, so I have to figure out what do I want to do with all of my wonderful, aesthetic, beautiful collections. So it's a kind of, it's an interesting question to think about. I don't know. I think I'm much more aware of legacy as I'm aging. It's not like I spend a lot of time thinking about my afterlife, though. Okay, here's an example. Okay,
Yeah.
my clock, my iPhone just 4:15 p.m. It's my second timed alert of the day. The first one comes at 12:15 at noon, and it's like to remind me of being in God's presence.
Oh.
To remind me of being in God's presence. So this one was Ashrei Yoshvei Beitecha, is the Mincha prayer, the evening prayer at Ma'ariv Aravim. I'm trying to remember. I don't even remember what the morning prayer is going to say. But it's living with God's presence in the midst of it all. I think that's, and I like to think that my work is to help people live their life more fully without wasting a lot of their time and energy being afraid of death. And for me, belief in afterlife has, I don't know, just it gives me a different sense of it. My teacher, Reb Zalman, would say, I'm looking forward to my next redeployment.
So is he a fervent believer in reincarnation?
Well, that's another whole thing. So from the 12th...
Oh, yeah, we started with reincarnation, and then we purposely...
Well, we're reincarnating to that. So from the 12th century on, reincarnation is as kosher as Mogen David wine and Manischewitz.
It's just assumed. Like, we're not arguing about this. Just part of the thing.
I could pick up a Siddur, a prayer book, that would be done by Art Scroll. Art Scroll is like dyed-in-wool Orthodox Brooklyn. And there's a prayer that one says at night, the Kriyat Shema Hamita, the Shema Yisrael prayer at bedtime, and it says, God, forgive me for anyone I've harmed, begilgul zeh, begilgul acher, in this incarnation and any other incarnation. So that's right in there in normative orthodoxy. But like everything else, it's said, but it's not really understood. But yes, it's part of it. It's part of the tradition. I studied for a while with Brian Weiss, so I have some sense of what might have been previous incarnations. And there's a lot of people who carry old Holocaust stories, which is a whole other thing. So incarnation is part of the whole drama.